disruptive.
America that I fought for.
Weird thing to happen. All right, folks. So here's an interesting story that's shedding a light on the Canadian largest public broadcaster, using the term lightly, the CBC, which has a lot of scrutiny to deal with. I mean, the whole scandal with Catherine Tate, the CEO that got, bribed by the Canadian government, stole a bunch of money from them that was supposed to go towards people working at the CBC. They got nothing. Catherine Tate took the money. There was a scandal involving that. On top of many other things, a former producer at the CBC is calling out their behavior on the coverage of the genocide going on in the Middle East. Now, it's kind of interesting how in Canada, they're kind of filming this in both sections of light. It's almost like they're trying to mimic the idea that they care about the Palestinians, but not enough to actually report on the real situation of why Hamas existed, unlike the coverage that we have doing. They're trying to pander both sides, and it just seems like a cowardly approach in the fact that they're still shifting this towards Israel and AIPAC, obviously, because they're, a luxurious lobby firm that controls a lot of governments and controls a lot of media empires. But they're trying to pander to both sides, and it doesn't seem to be working. So this came out in The Breach. This is a independent online site here in Canada here. And it says a CBC producer is lifting the veil on how the broadcaster whitewashed Israel's horrors in Gaza. In a tell-all essay, she describes the inner workings of newsrooms where double standards and biases sidelined the truth before she resigned in protest. And it links to an article here. This is what she said in this, what she told people at The Breach here. So it says, the executive producer peered at me with concern. It was November 16, 2023, and I had been called into a virtual meeting at the CBC. I was approaching my 6th year with the public broadcaster, where I worked as a producer in television and radio. He said he could tell I was passionate about what was happening in Gaza. His job, he told me, was to ensure my passion wasn't making me biased. He said, I haven't crossed the line yet, but I had to be careful. The conversation ended with him suggesting that I might want to go on a mental health leave. On a mental health leave for having concern about genocide. Nice. I declined. My mind was fine. I could clearly see what was happening. Earlier that day, I spoken out in a meeting with my team at CBC News Network, the broadcaster's 24-hour television news channel. It was 6 weeks into Israel's siege and bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which had me, at the time, killed over 11,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children. Legal experts were already suggesting that that was taking place and could be a potential genocide, with Israeli Holocaust scholar calling it a textbook case. I expressed concern to my team about the frequency of Palestinian guests being canceled, the scrutiny brought to bear on their statements, and the pattern of double standards in our coverage. After this, I pitched a reasonable and balanced interview to genocide scholars with opposing views, discussing whether Israel's actions and rhetoric fit the legal definition of the crime. Senior colleagues surrounded my panic. My executive producer replied that we had to be careful not to put the host in a difficult position. They want time to consult with higher-ups before making a decision. A few hours later, I was sitting across from the same executive being warned about crossing the line. The following afternoon, I showed up for what was supposed to be a typical meeting to go over the interviews we had lined up for a couple days, but seemed unusual guests were present. In addition to my coworkers, the faces of my executive producer and his higher-ups appeared on a Google Meet. See, this is why I use the term lightly public broadcaster in regards to CBC, because in order for to be public, you would think those higher-ups would be the viewers. You would think that would be the point of a public broadcaster, but no, the higher-ups are corporate interest, which, again, if you're involved with corporate interests, if corporate interest inflicts your programming at a public broadcaster, does that make you a public broadcaster at this point? Like, does that even qualify you to even use that phrase? Um, the managers were there to talk about my pitch. They said they weren't vetoing it. They weren't meant to make it difficult editorial decisions, but suggested our show wasn't the best venue. I pointed out that the network was deemed a suitable place for interviews with guests who characterizes Russia's war on Ukraine and China's oppression of the Uyghurs, or is it Uyghurs? I don't know how to pronounce that, as instances of genocide. The managers looked uncomfortable. I was reassigned to work on the panel with two guests calling on the West to support regime change in Moscow and Tehran. Ever since these unusual meetings had started, I was recording them for my own protection. So the fact that this employee was calling out the double standard, and this is something that most people would point out in mainstream media, is the fact they're okay and they're concerned about Russia going into Ukraine and causing a genocide over there, which they're not. If you look at the actual statistics and facts, they're concerned about that. They're concerned about, China and possibly invading Taiwan and how awful that would be. But they're not concerned about Israel into Gaza or into Lebanon and continuing this tirade, which is the whole point of the genocidal agenda as part of the Zionist project. Their whole purpose of all this, that's why they had to have October 7th, that's why they created Hamas, was to find a way to advance their warfare, advance their regime, and take over Palestinian territory to then completely wipe out that population, wipe out that civilization, and sell it off to their conglomeracies, sell off to other Zionists to further their advancement, further their Zionist project, the whole Greater Israel project. That's the whole point of it. But they won't mention it. But that wasn't the end of the blowback. The next week, late on Friday afternoon, I received an email from the same two managers who had poured cold water on my pitch. They needed to speak to me urgently. Over the phone, I was asked to keep the conversation secret. They told me I had hurt the feelings of some of my two coworkers. But it was more than just hurt feelings. Someone was accusing me of anti-Semitism. I had to appear cross the line. Trying to work up my way to permanent position at Canada's public broadcaster requires knowing the sort of stories, angles, and guests that were acceptable and which are out of bounds. As a precautious, casual employee, a class of worker that makes up over a quarter of CBC's workforce, it hadn't taken me long to realize what the subject of Israel-Palestine was going to be avoided whenever possible. When it was covered, it was tactically expected to be framed in such a way as to obscure history and sanitize contemporary reality. After October 7th, it was no longer possible for the corporation to continue avoiding it. But because CBC had never properly contextualized the world's largest active military occupation in the lead up to the atrocity, it was ill-equipped to report on what happened next. The CBC would spend the following months whitewashing the horrors what Israel would visit on Palestinians in Gaza. In the days after Israel began its bombing campaign, this was already evident, while virtually no scrutiny was applied to Israeli officials and experts. On an unprecedented level of suspicion was being brought to bear on the family members of those trapped in Gaza. My job required me to vet the work of associate producers and to oversee interviews. So I was well positioned to see the double standard up close. At first, out of concern that would jeopardize my chances of landing a staff job that I had recently applied for, I only voiced mild pushback. But as the death toll mounted, my career started to seem less important. If journalists in Gaza were sacrificing their lives to tell the truth, I should at least be prepared to take some risks. Besides, I naively told myself it would be easier for me to dissent than most of my colleagues. I am mixed Jewish heritage, having been raised by a father who fled the Holocaust as a young child and dealt with lifelong trauma and guilt of surviving his family members were murdered by the Nazis. it would be more challenging, I believe, for cynical actors to wield false accusations of anti Semitism against me. I turned out to be wrong. It turned out to be wrong. So that is absolutely devastating. And then this is where the double standard comes in also. Is in the run up to October 7th, a senior colleague said that they were lucky the news gods would shine upon us and put an end to the stretch of slow news days. Waking up on the fateful Saturday to multiple alerts on my phone, I knew that both the world and my professional life were about to dramatically change. Even before October 2023, trying to persuade senior CBC colleagues to report accurately on Palestinians was a struggle. Here are some of the TV interview ideas that a colleague and I pitched but had turned down. Human Rights Watch 2021 report designate Israel an apartheid state. The Sheikh Jarrah evictions in the same year. Israel assassination Palestinian American journalist Shiri Abdul Khaleh in 2022, and the Israeli bombing of the Jenin refugee camp in July of 2023. The last of these ideas were initially greenlit, but was later canceled because a senior producer was concerned that the host would have too much on her plate. Around the same time, I also pitched someone from the Israeli human rights organization, I can't even pronounce that name, to talk about the potential impact of widely protested judicial reforms on Palestinians. But this was nixed for fears of complaints. This would become familiar excuses. After October 7th, I dreaded going to work every shift and the impact of biases. So, it's a very long story, so we can go on hours and hours, but it shows the complete just insanity of this, and the fact that this is coming from, again, a public broadcaster who disregards the notions of the general public to inform them of what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and actually provide explanation of the lead up of this war, why exactly Hamas did what they did, where Hamas originated from. They never reported on the fact that Netanyahu himself coordinated with this Likud party to organize Hamas to establish themselves in Palestine because they want to thwart any Palestinian liberation to to free themselves from the restrictions of the Israeli military put upon Gaza. They never tell you about that. They never tell you about the suitcases of cash that Netanyahu sent to Hamas to continue flourishing. They never taught you about the fact that people in the October 7th at the concert event that were victims of being captured and being held hostages, they're the ones suing the IDF right now. They're suing the IDF, not Palestinians. They're suing Israel for the lack of security at an event where they knew it was going to be dangerous. They knew that having a lucrative event, a mass gathering, listening to music next to the gates of Gaza where they have tortured people was going to be a bad idea. But they did that purposely. The CBC refuses to do that. Why? Because higher ups, meaning corporate entities, meaning APEC, meaning lobby firms that have funneled money to the CBC, don't want you to hear the truth. And that's what this woman is telling you here, is that the CBC, the public broadcaster, is refusing to tell you the exact truth, restricting their journalistic ethics because higher ups might be offended. Higher ups, the Zionist cult project, these people that have been brainwashed and mentally disformed over years of lies, over lies of bigotry, over the fact that they believe that they're the higher power. There's a biblical prophecy. That's why they have to associate themselves with Judaism, even though it has nothing to do with Jewish faith. It's actually diminishing the true proponents of being a Jew, and it's actually more anti-Semitic to be a Zionist attacking Jewish people, which is what they're doing now, than to point this out. And they're trying to play it both ways. The CBC trying to play both ways. You see it also CTV News, Global News. The only difference is that CTV and Global and City TV and all these other outlets, we know that they're corporate entities. We know that they're brought to you by advertisers. They're brought to you by corporate entities that already pay for the news. But this is a public broadcaster. This is a corporation that still lies to the people as being a public broadcaster. And because they're a public broadcaster, they should have the obligation to tell people the truth about this, but they refuse to do so. Why? Because corporate entities that have already bought into the CBC for many, many years corrupted this organization and turned the public broadcaster against the public to misinform people so that it works well in favor of APEC lobby firms, of people that are Zionist and corporate entities that promote the Zionist project. They profit off it. Business interests like McDonald's and Starbucks and all these other corporate entities that are in support of this. So the fact that the CBC can still call themselves a public broadcaster while do this to their own general employee and lie to the general public, their own audience, about what's going on, playing both sides like they don't know what's going on, but they do know what's going on, is just outright disgusting. It's outright disgusting. And why would they still call themselves a public broadcaster if they're having corporate entities diminishing their journalistic ethics? Why would they still call themselves a public entity if they're refusing to tell the public the true stories? This is why people have concerns with the CBC. This is why the coin of phrase defund the CBC came about. Because your tax dollars pay for this channel, pay for this network to lie to you that's already been brought to you by corporate entities. So why is it continuing to be a public broadcaster if it's already getting backings from large corporations purposely lying to you? But this employee at CBC, a former producer that spoke out about this, I don't know what her name is. I think it's Molly Schumann. Molly Schumann. That's the one who wrote this article. I'm assuming that's who, how she's describing her career. That is, the fact that she's willing to speak out about this is courageous, given the situation that we're in. And we need more voices like that. We need more voices to fully understand how detrimental not only the situation in Gaza is and Lebanon is. Like, genocide is horrific regardless of how you feel about it. But also just the fact that Western media is complacent with it because we have such higher overlords like the APEC lobby that infiltrate our media and actually diminish our values of good journalism in order to back the horrific genocide, the continuation of mass slaughter of innocent lives. And that's what the CBC is doing. Like I said, CTV, Global, any other conglomeracy, even the United States, NBC, CBS, those are our corporate networks. So I wouldn't expect anything less being from corporate networks. But if you're a public broadcaster, like the CBC claims to be, and you're doing this stuff, then something needs to give. Then obviously you are not a public broadcaster. If you're receiving taxpayer-funded money and corporate entity money to diminish journalistic ethics to lie to the general public, we're not a public broadcaster because you are turning a blind eye to the public, disinforming them to aid to your corporate masters. That's not what a public broadcaster does.